Did you know the top 20 games on Steam's player counts account for 60% of the total player count of the top 100 games? Hey everyone, and welcome to the Cloud Gaming Extreme channel. Today we're having a look at the top 20 Steam games available on GeForce NOW. Unfortunately, we wish it was all 20, but actually 13 out of the top 20 games are available on GeForce NOW. As I said, the top 20 Steam games actually account for 60% of the total players when looking at the 24-hour peak. GeForce NOW's 13 games account for 76% of all the players in the top 20, so not too bad, being 7 games down and only 24% of the player count down. So definitely some popular games available on GeForce NOW. So what I'm going to do is introduce each of the games, talk a bit about the performance, and yes, I've played every single one of these on the GeForce NOW 3080 tier, and that's the footage that you're going to see here for each game, and then give you a minute of the gameplay with no commentary so you can get a look and feel. Feel free to skip through the video for any of the games that you're more interested in or ones that you've already seen or played. So without further ado, let's get into this. Starting off with the number 1, and this has been the number 1 most played game on Steam for some time, apart from the launch of New World, but back firmly in the top spot of CSGO. This is Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and after playing a few rounds, it's very quick and easy to see why people are so addicted. If you ever played the original Counter-Strike, this is definitely a trip down memory lane, and as you can see, getting over 200 frames per second on the 3080 tier, which is being streamed capped at 120, but it made it an extremely fluid experience and extremely fun. Now this is a very harsh game, so if you do mess up, it's over pretty quickly, but it's definitely a great one to get into and a fantastic addition to GeForce NOW. Enjoy this bit of gameplay before we move over to our next game. Next up is Dota 2, and again this has been firmly up in the second place for concurrent players for quite some time now, and is easy to see why. There's huge esports around Dota 2 and it's very gripping. These are fully maxed out with the effects pumped up to the absolute max as well, and we're still getting 120 plus frames per second both on the stream and in game. As you can see, it looks absolutely gorgeous. Very complicated game to get your head around, when really the crux of the game is to not die, which I did end up doing quite a lot, but not the fault of GeForce NOW, just my poor experience. But as you can see, it looks and plays absolutely fantastically on the 3080 tier. Enjoy this bit of gameplay before we move over to the next game. Next up is Apex Legends. This is firmly in the third spot fairly regularly. Again, it takes a bit of getting used to the mechanics of this game, but I did manage to get a kill, which made me extremely happy. Apex Legends has always been a little bit too fast paced for me, but with the Origin overlay here we can see that we're getting 146 plus frames per second. I don't own this game on Steam, which is why you're seeing the Origin version, but it's firmly in the top Steam games, so you can play the Steam version if you own it. It is an extremely fun game though, and with it pumped up to the max, having over 120 frames per second is certainly an advantage in game, and being able to spot those people and having those lightning reactions really helps. Unfortunately, my aim is still not that great. Enjoy this bit of gameplay before we move over to the next video. Next up is one of my favourite games of all time. I grew up playing Team Fortress 2 and it was awesome to dive back into this. And just to show off the fantastic speed of the 3080 tier, I had to go for the sniper class and see if I could pick up a few people off the battlements, and I'm very pleased to say that I did. It's very satisfying being able to snipe people as they jump off the battlements or have a good sniper battle, and the 3080's lag-free input certainly made that possible. As you can see with the frame counter here, over 200 frames per second in game with everything maxed out. However, the stream is capped at 120 frames per second for the PC, although that's more than good enough in my opinion. Enjoy the gameplay before we move over to the next game.
Has returned to our base.
Everything above your head.
Next up is NARAKA BLADEPOINT. Now this has stormed the charts recently and is an extremely fun game. I have mixed opinions of this game, as every time I play I have a very different experience, depending on whether I get the character of my choice or not. This time I did, so it was a much more enjoyable experience. But much like Apex, if you don't get the character you're after, then it can really throw you off your game. Frames per second took a bit of a hit on this one with everything maxed out, getting around 80 to 90 most of the time, so not being able to take full advantage of that 120 frames per second stream. However, I did have all of the view range and all the other settings completely maxed out, so you could drop those down to make sure you get your 120 rock solid. I'll leave you with a little bit of gameplay here before we move over to our next game.
Behold, my weapon is reforged anew. I shall purify the souls of my children. This brilliant sword can hit nothing in its current state. Our foes approach. May the pain remind you of what else I can do. If I threw this, it might do some minor damage. Beauty under fire! Why do they challenge me? It never ends well. Foes are among us. Purify the souls of their filth.
Next up is Rust, and this is a love-hate relationship I have with this game. I love the concept, but I hate playing it, and that's mainly because every time I feel like I'm getting somewhere, I get killed. Now it's usually by another player randomly, although the players in this server were quite scarce, so it did give me time to build up. But if you watch the full gameplay, which is over on the Access channel, you'll see that I stupidly picked a fight with a boar and lost everything. Gameplay wise, Rust is another one that really takes a bit of a hit, even with the 3080, averaging around 70 frames per second completely maxed out, but I did have everything dialed up to the absolute maximum, including the draw distance and viewing angle. So again, if you want to get better performance, more with 120 frames per second, then you will need to drop down some of those settings. But the average of 60 to 70 frames per second is more than enough, I feel, for Rust. I'll leave you with a bit of gameplay here before we move over to the next game. Next up is Amazon's New World. This stormed to the top of the charts and did knock CSGO off of the top spot for a few days. However, now it's closer to just about the bottom of the top 10. New World is definitely one of my favourite MMORPGs of all time. However, on the 3080 it's not quite as crisp as I would like. Again, even with the 3080 tier here, we're getting around 60 to 90 frames per second depending on what's going on, with everything on very high. You can see that we even dip down into the 50 frames per second here, and the character seems to have this slight blur around them, which I do find a little bit distracting, which doesn't seem to be present when I'm playing locally. It only seems to be an issue with New World with this slight fuzziness around the character model, and I just don't understand why. However, it still plays exceptionally well and is a good replacement for local, especially if you don't have a decent PC. I'll leave you with a bit of gameplay here before we move over to the next game. Next up is Ark, another game that I love to hate, but this is mostly over the graphics, as I do feel that Ark can look a lot better. It looks absolutely stunning on GeForce Now, and then we do get a bit of stream compression. However, it is another brutal game that most of the time it's a random dinosaur that kills me. But again, in this server it was quite sparse, and I did actually survive my first encounter with a few little ankle biters. When I say a few, I did get hounded by around 5 of them, but I actually came off okay. Enough to build up my first hut, and I must say GeForce Now did perform exceptionally well, and Ark is another game that I dread going into because of the initial load time, which isn't helped massively by the difference in the servers every time, but averaging around 50 to 60 frames per second with everything maxed out here did perform exceptionally well, so I can see how people get very addicted to it. However, I do get extremely frustrated with survival games when I do die and lose everything. So enjoy a bit of my hut building here before we move over to the next game. Next up is Warframe, and this is a fast, frantic, awesome shooter that I do always enjoy every time I come back into. However, I do feel that Destiny 2 has kind of stolen its thunder. Warframe is still a fantastic free-to-play title though, and as you can see, over 200 frames per second in the midst of big battles here. Not an issue with Warframe absolutely maxed out on the graphics front. It is still extremely fun, and I am playing as the Vault Warframe here, and all the instance style battles do make for some good joint gameplay when you do get co-op, but most of it is able to be done as single player, so you're not always reliant on waiting for groups. So the frame was capped at 120 frames per second here, but the game easily managing over 200, even with all the special effects going on, so extremely good to play. I'll leave you with a bit more of the gameplay here before we move over to our next game.
The scanner has picked up a target. Go to the dig site. That's it. You found an artful part blueprint. Head to extraction when you are ready. We need another power cell for the excavator.
And as I mentioned, Destiny 2, that's the next up on our list. And this is another game that I can lose a lot of time to every time I dive in for a bit of testing, because of all of the random events and just general fun that you can have playing Destiny 2. I do extremely enjoy it every time I pick up this game, and half of this is because of how beautiful it looks on the 3080 tier, getting 90 plus frames per second most of the time, over 100 when we're generally moving around, but in the combat it does dip down to the 90s, but it still looks and plays absolutely fantastic. And as you can see here from all of the effect, it is just fun to play and looks absolutely gorgeous. I'll leave you with a bit more of the gameplay here before we move over to our next game. Next up is Rainbow Six Siege, and this game is also extremely addictive, and I can see why so many people still play. I did manage to get a couple of wins and also some pretty cool kills, and because I have Ubisoft Plus, I do have pretty much all of the operators as part of that package, and that does come extremely handy, especially as Ayana is one of my favourite operators. Performance wise, we're getting well over 160 frames per second, rock solidly, even with everything maxed out, which definitely gives a huge advantage. Reaction time wise, GeForce NOW is definitely well up there and really helps with those twitch movements. I'll leave you with a bit more gameplay here before we move over to our next game.
Diffusion initiated. Protect the diffuser. Op 4 eliminated. Friendly mission successful.
I was quite surprised to see The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt up into the top 20, but that meant I get to give it another go. It's been a while since I played The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, and that was on the priority tier, so it was very interesting to see the 3080 tier here, and this is one of those games that I feel is a bit dated for the 3080 tier. Even with everything maxed out, it definitely did not push the 3080 to its limit, getting over 120 frames per second, quite easily a lot of the time. Unfortunately, the anti-aliasing and just the general characters doesn't look as good as I would hope it would, but this is an issue with the game graphics rather than the 3080 tier itself. If you are going to be playing The Witcher 3 though, it is a fantastic way to play, and you will definitely not have any performance issues using the 3080 tier. I'll leave you with a bit more gameplay here before we move over to our next game.
Corpse explains the stench. The priceless frying pan. Looks like the mystery man didn't need the pan so much as the soot off it to make ink, write letters.
What's that, dearie?
Nothing. Documents, almost entirely burned. A few pieces still legible.
But when I gab to myself, they say I'm going barmy.
His throat. He was garroted. And some old scars.
Last up is another surprise entry for me into the top 20 Steam games of 7 Days to Die. Surprise, surprise, it's another survival game. This has a bit of a twist as you are in a zombie infested world, and it is procedural generated and can also have multiplayer, but is quite small instances compared to some of the other survival games. However, the zombies are quite harsh and it is very easy to die. You have all of the base mechanics and also the crafting mechanics, so it definitely is another game to get your teeth into. The 3080 again took quite a bit of a hit on this, and I think this is because of the procedural generation of the map and just the general destructiveness and pickups of the type of environment, as all the grass is destructible as well as most of the other items. So getting dips down into the 50 and 60 frames per second here quite regularly, although it still looked and played absolutely fantastically on the 3080. I'll leave you with a bit more gameplay here with the 7 Days to Die to round off this video. Thanks for watching, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, stay up to date with all things cloud gaming. Let us know in the comments below what your favourite game on GeForce NOW for 2021 was, and we hope to see a lot more of these in the new year.